The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Camilla Parker Bowles quietly made her way through the servants' quarters. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small overnight bag, trying to appear casual despite the racing of her heart. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on her shoulders, and the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room had become unbearable. For weeks, the palace had been buzzing with tension. Leaked documents suggesting financial irregularities in royal charities had somehow been traced back to her office, though she knew she had nothing to do with them. The media circus that followed was relentless, with photographers camping outside every entrance and reporters shouting questions whenever she appeared in public. Even worse were the cold stares from other members of the royal family during their weekly dinners, the kind of looks that could freeze water in July. Charles had been supportive in public, standing by her side during official engagements with his characteristic stoic demeanor, but in private their conversations had grown strained. He would retreat to his study for hours, emerging only for meals where they ate in uncomfortable silence. The man who once wrote her passionate letters now seemed like a stranger, buried under the weight of royal duty and public scrutiny. The plan had formed gradually in her mind over sleepless nights. She needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out how to clear her name without the constant pressure of palace protocol. Her sister had a cottage in the French countryside, a place where she could disappear for a few weeks until the storm passed. All she needed was to reach the private airfield outside London, where a friend had arranged for a small charter plane. As she walked through the familiar corridors, memories flooded back of happier times. The day Charles had first brought her here as his wife, how overwhelmed she had felt by the grandeur and history surrounding them. The staff had been welcoming then, genuinely pleased to see their king happy after years of loneliness. Now those same faces seemed guarded, uncertain of where loyalties should lie. The morning shift change was her window of opportunity. The night guards would be tired and focused on getting home, while the day staff would still be settling into their routines. She had studied the patterns for days, noting when the corridors were empty and which exits were least monitored. Her years in the palace had taught her more about its hidden passages and quiet corners than most people realized. Her phone buzzed with another text from her private secretary, asking about her schedule for the afternoon garden party. Camilla had canceled all her public engagements for the week, citing a minor illness, but the questions kept coming. Everyone wanted to know where she was, what she was thinking, whether she would make a statement to the press. The pressure felt like being trapped in a glass box with everyone watching her every move. The bag she carried contained only essentials, a few changes of clothes, her passport, some cash she had quietly withdrawn over the past week, and a single photograph of her and Charles from their wedding day. Everything else could be replaced, but she needed that reminder of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. Before the crown and the duty and the endless scrutiny had complicated everything. As she approached the side entrance that led to the staff parking area, she could hear the distant sounds of the palace waking up. Kitchen staff preparing breakfast, housekeepers beginning their rounds, gardeners heading out to tend the grounds. It was a world that had become as familiar as her own home, yet now felt alien and hostile. She wondered if she would ever feel comfortable here again, or if this escape would mark the beginning of the end of her royal life. The key to the side door was hidden exactly where the friendly night porter had told her it would be. He was one of the few staff members who still treated her with genuine warmth, understanding perhaps that she was as much a victim of circumstances as anyone else. His quiet tip about the shift change schedule had made this morning possible, though she doubted he realized how she intended to use the information. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the palace walls. For the first time in weeks, Camilla felt like she could breathe properly. The car she had arranged was waiting in the shadows of the service area, an ordinary sedan that would blend in with London traffic. The driver was a discreet professional who asked no questions and made no conversation, exactly what she needed. As they pulled away from the palace, she allowed herself one look back at the imposing building that had been her home for years. The flags were already flying, indicating that other members of the royal family were in residence. Soon they would discover her absence and the questions would begin. But by then she hoped to be far away, finally able to think clearly about her future without the constant weight of expectation and judgment. The journey to the airfield would take less than an hour in light traffic, and her flight was scheduled to depart just after noon. By evening, she would be in France, breathing different air and sleeping in a bed where no one would think to look for her. It felt like the first positive step she had taken in months, a small act of rebellion against a system that seemed determined to crush her spirit. But as the palace grew smaller in the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that somehow her carefully planned escape had not gone as unnoticed as she had hoped. Detective Chief Inspector Harrison Matthews had been with the Royal Protection Unit for 15 years, long enough to develop an almost supernatural sense for when something was wrong. This particular morning, that instinct was screaming at him as he reviewed the overnight security reports in his cramped office overlooking the palace mews. The night shift had noted several minor irregularities: a door left unlocked that should have been secured, unusual movement in the service corridors captured on security cameras, and most concerning of all, the Queen Consort's personal protection officer reporting that her morning briefing had been canceled without explanation. Matthews prided himself on knowing the routines and habits of every member of the royal family under his protection. Camilla was particularly punctual, almost obsessively so, arriving for her morning briefing at exactly 8:30 every day regardless of her evening schedule. Her private secretary had mentioned feeling unwell as the reason for the cancellation, but something about the explanation felt off. In his experience, members of the royal family rarely canceled security briefings unless something serious was happening. The first real alarm came when he tried to reach Camilla's personal protection officer, Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen, on her radio. Chen was supposed to be stationed outside the Queen Consort's private apartment, but there was no response to his calls. This was unprecedented. Chen was one of his most reliable officers, a former military police specialist who had never missed a check-in during her 3 years with the unit. Matthews grabbed his jacket and headed toward the royal apartments, his pace quickening with each step. The corridors of the palace seemed unusually quiet as he made his way through the maze of passages that connected the various wings. Staff members he passed avoided eye contact, their movements hurried and nervous. The atmosphere felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to vibrate with tension. His radio crackled to life as he walked, other officers reporting normal activities. But Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. When he reached the Queen Consort's apartment, he found Detective Sergeant Chen standing rigidly outside the door, her face pale and her eyes fixed straight ahead. She snapped to attention when she saw him approaching, but there was something in her expression that immediately put him on high alert. Chen was not someone who rattled easily, yet she clearly seemed shaken by something. "What's the situation here, Sergeant?" Matthews asked, keeping his voice low and professional, despite the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. Chen glanced around nervously before responding. "Sir, I've been unable to make contact with the Queen Consort since approximately 0600 hours. Her private secretary informed me that all morning appointments were canceled due to illness, but..." She hesitated, clearly struggling with how to phrase her concerns. "But what, Sergeant? Speak freely." "Sir, at 0545, I observed an individual matching the Queen Consort's description leaving the building through the East Service entrance. The person was carrying what appeared to be an overnight bag, and moved in a manner suggesting they wished to avoid detection. However, I was specifically instructed not to follow or interfere unless directly ordered to do so." Matthews felt his blood pressure spike. "Who gave you those instructions?" "The order came through the duty officer's desk approximately 30 minutes before my shift began, sir. It was logged as coming from the Queen Consort's private office, though I found it unusual given standard protection protocols." The pieces were starting to fall into place, and Matthews didn't like the picture they were forming. Someone had deliberately created a gap in security coverage, and now one of the most high-profile members of the royal family was potentially missing. He reached for his secure radio to contact the control room, but Chen's hand on his arm stopped him. "Sir, there's something else. I received a call approximately 10 minutes ago from Detective Inspector Williams at Heathrow. He was conducting routine security checks and noticed that the Queen Consort's passport was flagged in the system as being used for an outbound flight departure. The flight is scheduled to leave from a private airfield outside London in approximately 3 hours. Matthews stared at her in disbelief. This was rapidly escalating beyond a simple security concern, into a potential crisis that could have international implications. A member of the royal family attempting to leave the country without proper security clearance or official notification was unprecedented in his experience. The media attention alone would be catastrophic, but the security implications were even worse. "Have you confirmed she's actually gone?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Chen nodded toward the apartment door. "I used my emergency access key approximately 15 minutes ago to conduct a welfare check. The apartment appears to have been vacated hastily, with several drawers left open and items of clothing scattered on the bed. There was no sign of the queen consort, and her personal mobile phone was left behind on the bedside table. The implications hit Matthews like a physical blow. Leaving behind her phone was either a sign of extreme distress or a deliberate attempt to avoid being tracked. Either way, it suggested that whatever was driving Camilla's apparent flight was serious enough to make her abandon the security protocols that had been drilled into her for years. His mind raced through the potential consequences. If word of this reached the media before they could locate her, it would trigger a feeding frenzy that could destabilize the monarchy itself. The recent scandals had already put enormous pressure on the royal family, and the queen consort's apparent flight would be seen as confirmation of guilt by many. Even if she returned within hours, the damage to her reputation and the institution itself might be irreparable. Matthews reached for his radio again, this time with grim determination. "Control, this is DCI Matthews. I need immediate contact with the duty coordinator and the head of royal communications. We have a Code 7 situation developing." Code 7 was their internal designation for a missing member of the royal family, a scenario they had trained for but hoped never to encounter. As he waited for the response, Matthews found himself thinking about the woman he had been protecting for the past several years. Camilla had always been gracious and considerate with the security staff, remembering their names and asking about their families. She had seemed genuinely committed to her royal duties. Despite the constant criticism and scrutiny she faced, something must have pushed her to the breaking point to make her take such a drastic step. The radio crackled back to life with an urgent summons to the communications center. As Matthews hurried toward what he knew would be a crisis meeting, he couldn't help but wonder if they were already too late to prevent a catastrophe that would rock the very foundations of the British monarchy. The communications center at Buckingham Palace had been transformed into a war room. Within minutes of DCI Matthews's urgent call, banks of monitors displayed everything from live news feeds to real-time traffic cameras, while a team of analysts worked frantically at their computers. The head of Royal Communications, Victoria Sterling, stood at the center of it all like a general commanding troops, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of stress as she barked orders into her headset. Sterling had weathered many storms during her decade managing the royal family's public image, but nothing quite like this. The Queen Consort's apparent disappearance came at the worst possible time, with the charity scandal still dominating headlines and public opinion polls showing declining support for the monarchy. If word leaked that Camilla had fled the country, it would confirm every conspiracy theory and fuel speculation that she was guilty of the allegations being made against her. "I need a complete media blackout on this until we know exactly what we're dealing with," Sterling commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos of the control room. "Contact our allies at the major news organizations and invoke the D-Notice system. This is a matter of national security until proven otherwise." The D-Notice system was Britain's voluntary agreement between the government and media to suppress publication of information that could harm national security. It was rarely used, and invoking it would signal to journalists that something significant was happening. But it would buy them precious time to locate Camilla before the story exploded across the internet. Meanwhile, at the private airfield outside London, Camilla's carefully planned escape was proceeding exactly as she had hoped. The facility catered to wealthy individuals who valued discretion, and the staff were well trained in maintaining their clients' privacy. She had changed clothes in the terminal's VIP lounge, trading her recognizable palace attire for simple jeans and a baseball cap that helped conceal her distinctive features. The pilot of her chartered aircraft was a professional who had flown many high-profile passengers without incident. He conducted his pre-flight checks with mechanical precision, unaware that his passenger was currently the subject of an unprecedented search by Britain's security services. The flight plan filed with air traffic control listed their destination as a small regional airport in southwestern France, a journey that would take just over 2 hours. As Camilla waited in the departure lounge, she tried to read a magazine to calm her nerves, but the words blurred together on the page. Every sound made her look up nervously, expecting to see police officers or palace security storming through the doors. She had turned off her phone hours ago, knowing that it could be tracked, but the isolation felt overwhelming. For the first time since her marriage, she was truly on her own, without the constant presence of protection officers or the structured routine of royal life. Back at the palace, the crisis team was expanding rapidly as more senior officials were briefed on the situation. The king's private secretary had been summoned from his country estate, while the Metropolitan Police's special branch coordinated with MI5 to assess potential security implications. The possibility that Camilla's departure was connected to a larger plot, or that she was being coerced, could not be ruled out. Charles himself remained unaware of his wife's disappearance, attending a scheduled meeting with government ministers at Windsor Castle. The decision to delay informing him was controversial but practical. His reaction needed to be carefully managed to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. If he appeared in public looking distressed or angry, it would immediately signal to the press that something was wrong. DCI Matthews found himself at the center of a rapidly expanding investigation as teams of officers were deployed to every airport, train station, and port in the London area. The challenge was conducting a thorough search without creating the kind of visible police presence that would attract media attention. Each team had been briefed to approach their assignment as a routine security exercise, but Matthews knew it was only a matter of time before questions started being asked. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A traffic camera near the private airfield had captured footage of Camilla entering the terminal building 2 hours earlier. The timestamp on the video confirmed that she was likely still at the facility, since her flight wasn't scheduled to depart for another 30 minutes. Matthews felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he realized they might actually be able to intercept her before she left British soil. The decision on how to proceed fell to Victoria Sterling, who weighed the options with the cold calculation of someone who understood that the monarchy's future might depend on getting this right. A heavy-handed police intervention could traumatize Camilla and create exactly the kind of dramatic scene that would dominate headlines for weeks. But allowing her to leave the country would signal that the royal family was in complete crisis, potentially triggering constitutional questions about the stability of the institution itself. "We go in quietly," Sterling decided after consulting with the king's senior advisors. "No uniforms, no sirens, no drama. DCI Matthews will approach her personally and try to persuade her to return voluntarily. If she refuses, we'll have to consider more forceful options. But let's hope it doesn't come to that." As the covert operation swung into motion, satellite phones buzzed with encrypted messages and unmarked vehicles began moving toward the airfield. The next hour would determine whether this crisis could be contained or whether it would explode into the most damaging scandal in the monarchy's modern history. At the airfield, Camilla checked her watch again and noticed that boarding should have begun 15 minutes ago. When she approached the desk to inquire about the delay, the staff member's nervous smile and evasive answers immediately put her on alert. Something was wrong, and her carefully planned escape was beginning to unravel just when she thought she had finally found a way out of the nightmare her life had become. The unmarked black sedan carrying DCI Matthews and his team pulled into the private airfield's visitor parking area with the kind of practiced discretion that marked years of sensitive operations. Matthews had changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes, hoping to appear less threatening when he approached Camilla. His instructions were clear: bring her home safely and quietly, avoiding any confrontation that might escalate the situation or create the dramatic scenes that would feed the media frenzy everyone was desperate to avoid. Inside the terminal, Camilla's growing anxiety had sharpened into genuine alarm. The flight delay excuses were becoming increasingly implausible, and she noticed that the other passengers who had been waiting for different flights had mysteriously disappeared. The terminal staff, previously professional and accommodating, now avoided making eye contact and seemed to be deliberately keeping their distance from her. Her years in the public eye had taught her to recognize when people were nervous around her, and right now everyone in the building seemed on edge. She approached the main desk again, this time abandoning any pretense of casual inquiry. "I need to speak to the manager immediately," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of royal training. "There seems to be some confusion about my flight, and I require an explanation." The young woman behind the counter looked genuinely distressed as she fumbled with her computer keyboard. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a technical issue with the aircraft. The pilot is conducting additional safety checks, but I'm sure we'll have you in the air very soon." Camilla studied the woman's face and recognized the signs of someone who had been instructed to stall for time. Her heart began racing as the implications became clear. Somehow, someone had discovered her plans and was moving to prevent her departure. The question was whether they intended to simply delay her or whether something more serious was about to happen. Outside, Matthews was coordinating with air traffic control to ensure that no flights would be permitted to depart until the situation was resolved. The airfield's manager, a discreet professional who had handled similar sensitive situations before, had agreed to cooperate fully with what he understood to be a matter of national security. The key was to resolve everything quietly, without creating the kind of scene that would inevitably leak to the press. As Matthews entered the terminal building, he immediately spotted Camilla standing near the large windows that overlooked the tarmac. Even in her casual disguise, her posture and bearing made her instantly recognizable to someone who had spent years observing her from a professional distance. She appeared calm from across the room, but he could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands gripped her small bag. The approach required delicate timing. Too aggressive and she might panic or attempt to run. Too casual, and she might not take the situation seriously enough to cooperate. Matthews had dealt with distressed members of the royal family before, but never in circumstances quite like these. The normal protocols and procedures simply didn't cover a situation where a senior royal was attempting to flee the country without authorization. When Camilla noticed him walking toward her, recognition flashed across her face, followed immediately by a look of resigned defeat. She had been expecting this moment since the flight delays began, but seeing Matthews in person made the reality of her failed escape attempt impossible to deny. All the careful planning, the weeks of preparation, the desperate hope for a few days of peace and anonymity had come to nothing. "Your Majesty," Matthews said quietly as he approached, using her formal title despite the circumstances. "I'm afraid I need to speak with you about returning to London." Camilla turned to face him fully, and Matthews was struck by how exhausted she looked. The woman who always appeared composed and regal in public seemed fragile and vulnerable in this moment, like someone who had been pushed beyond their breaking point. Her eyes held a mixture of anger, fear, and something that looked almost like relief at finally being caught. "I suppose there's no point in pretending I don't know why you're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but still carrying the crisp accent that marked her upper-class background. "How long have you known?" "We became aware of your departure approximately 3 hours ago," Matthews replied honestly. "Your protection officer was concerned when you missed your morning briefing, and we were able to track your movements from there." The mention of her protection officer brought a flash of guilt across Camilla's features. She had deliberately evaded Detective Sergeant Chen, knowing that her absence would eventually be noticed but hoping to buy enough time to get out of the country. The thought that she had put Chen in a difficult position with her superiors added another layer of regret to an already overwhelming situation. "I haven't done anything wrong," Camilla said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I just needed some time away from all of this. Is that really so terrible?" Matthews found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to balance his professional duties with genuine sympathy for someone who was clearly in distress. The training manuals didn't cover how to handle a member of the royal family who was having what appeared to be an emotional breakdown in a public space. "Ma'am, I understand that you're under tremendous pressure right now," he said carefully. "But leaving the country without proper security arrangements puts you at risk and creates serious concerns for everyone responsible for your safety. We need to discuss your return to London so that we can address whatever is driving these concerns." As they spoke, Matthews was acutely aware that other members of his team were positioned throughout the terminal, ready to intervene if the situation escalated. The airfield security cameras were recording everything, and he knew that this conversation would be analyzed in detail by his superiors. Every word and gesture mattered, not just for resolving the immediate crisis but for the potential long-term consequences. Camilla looked out at the aircraft that had been meant to carry her to freedom, its engines now silent on the tarmac. The symbol of her escape had become a reminder of her failure to break free from the golden cage that her royal life had become. The weight of expectation, duty, and constant scrutiny felt heavier than ever as she realized that there might truly be no way out of the situation that had engulfed her life. The silence stretched between Camilla and DCI Matthews for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant hum of aircraft engines and the muffled conversations of airfield staff who were trying to appear busy, while obviously keeping watch on the unfolding drama. Camilla's shoulders sagged as the full weight of her situation became clear. The escape she had planned so carefully was over before it had truly begun, and now she faced the prospect of returning to face whatever consequences awaited her. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Do you arrest me? Drag me back to the palace in handcuffs for the cameras to see?" Matthews shook his head immediately. "Nothing like that, Your Majesty. This isn't a criminal matter. We're simply concerned about your safety and well-being. The goal is to get you back to London quietly and discreetly, away from any public attention." But even as he spoke reassuringly, Matthews was receiving urgent messages through his earpiece. The situation back at the palace was deteriorating rapidly. Word of Camilla's disappearance had somehow leaked, and several news organizations were already making inquiries about rumors of a security incident involving a senior member of the royal family. The careful media blackout that Victoria Sterling had orchestrated was beginning to crack under pressure. More concerning was the report from Windsor Castle, where King Charles had finally been informed of his wife's attempted departure. According to his private secretary, the king's reaction had been a mixture of shock, anger, and what appeared to be genuine hurt. He was demanding answers about how such a situation had been allowed to develop and was reportedly considering canceling all his remaining engagements for the week. Camilla seemed to sense that something had changed in Matthews's demeanor. "There's more, isn't there?" she said, studying his face with the perceptiveness that came from years of reading people in high-pressure situations. "This has already become public, hasn't it?" Matthews struggled with how much to reveal. His instructions were to minimize Camilla's distress while securing her cooperation. But lying to her outright would only make things worse if she discovered the truth later. "There are some media inquiries beginning to surface," he admitted, "but nothing definitive has been published yet. The longer we delay your return, however, the harder it becomes to control the narrative." The mention of controlling the narrative triggered something in Camilla that had been building for weeks. The constant management of her public image, the careful scripting of every public appearance, the endless meetings with communication specialists who treated her like a brand to be managed, rather than a human being with genuine feelings and concerns. The dam of frustration and resentment that she had been holding back finally burst. "The narrative?" she said, her voice rising for the first time. "Is that all I am to you people? A story to be managed? I'm being accused of things I didn't do. My reputation is being destroyed by lies and innuendo, and all anyone cares about is managing the narrative." Her outburst drew the attention of everyone in the terminal, and Matthews quickly moved to position himself between Camilla and the handful of other people in the building. The last thing they needed was for someone to record video of the Queen Consort having an emotional breakdown in a public space. Such footage would be worth millions to the tabloids, and would guarantee that this incident became a defining moment in the history of the modern monarchy. "Your Majesty, I understand your frustration," Matthews said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "But right now, our priority has to be getting you somewhere safe where we can address these concerns properly. This terminal isn't secure, and every moment we spend here increases the risk of this situation becoming public in a way that helps no one." As if to emphasize his point, his earpiece crackled with another urgent update. A photographer from one of the major tabloids had been spotted near the airfield's perimeter fence, apparently tipped off by someone about unusual activity at the facility. Security teams were moving to intercept him, but it was only a matter of time before other journalists arrived on the scene. Camilla seemed to deflate as the reality of her situation became undeniable. The freedom she had thought was within reach was slipping away, replaced by the familiar weight of royal duty and public scrutiny. But there was something else in her expression now, a hardening resolve that suggested she wasn't going to simply submit to being led back to her golden cage without some conditions of her own. "If I agree to return with you," she said slowly, I want certain assurances. I want a meeting with Charles immediately, not in 3 days when the schedule allows for it. I want the investigation into the charity allegations expedited so that I can clear my name properly. And I want an end to the media briefings where anonymous palace sources suggest that I'm somehow responsible for things I knew nothing about. Matthews found himself in the difficult position of trying to negotiate on behalf of people who hadn't authorized him to make any commitments. His role was to secure Camilla's return, not to broker deals about palace politics or media strategy. But he could see that she was serious about her conditions, and he suspected that trying to force her compliance would only make the situation worse. I can relay your concerns to the appropriate people, he said carefully. But right now we need to focus on getting you back to London safely. These other issues can be addressed once you're in a secure environment. Camilla looked out at the aircraft one more time, as if memorizing the sight of the freedom that had been so briefly within her grasp. When she turned back to Matthews, her expression had shifted again, becoming the carefully composed mask she wore in public. The transformation was remarkable, as if she was putting on her royal persona like armor to protect herself from what was to come. "Very well," she said, her voice now steady and controlled. "But I want it on record that I'm returning voluntarily, not under any form of duress or arrest, and I want assurances that my luggage will be handled discreetly." It was only then that Matthews realized they still had to deal with the practical matter of retrieving her belongings and ensuring that no evidence of her attempted departure would surface to embarrass the royal family further. The bag she carried was just the beginning. There were financial records of her travel arrangements, communications with the people who had helped her plan the escape, and the potential testimony of dozens of people who had witnessed various parts of her journey. The journey back to London was conducted with military precision, but the tension inside the unmarked vehicle was almost suffocating. Camilla sat in the back seat staring out the window at the countryside passing by, her face an unreadable mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. Matthews sat beside her, speaking quietly into his radio as he coordinated with the teams that were already working to contain the fallout from her attempted departure. The operation to retrieve her luggage had been swift and thorough. Palace security officers had arrived at the airfield within minutes of her agreement to return, systematically collecting not just her personal belongings but also any security footage that might have captured her arrival or the subsequent intervention. The charter pilot had been debriefed and reminded of the confidentiality agreements that were standard for his clientele, while the airfield staff received similar visits from officials who emphasized the sensitive nature of what they had witnessed. But even as the immediate evidence was being controlled, Matthews knew that the real challenge lay ahead. Word of the incident had continued to spread through the palace's complex network of staff, officials, and advisors, each retelling adding new details and speculation. The communications team was fighting a losing battle against the rumor mill that fed the British press, and Matthews could only hope that they reached the palace before the story broke publicly. Victoria Sterling's voice crackled through his earpiece with regular updates that grew increasingly dire. 3 major newspapers were now actively investigating reports of a security incident involving the royal family. A television news crew had been spotted near the private airfield, apparently following up on tips from sources who remained maddeningly anonymous. Most concerning of all, social media was beginning to buzz with unconfirmed reports that Camilla had been detained by police, a completely false narrative that threatened to spiral out of control. Camilla seemed oblivious to the crisis management efforts swirling around her, lost in her own thoughts as the familiar landmarks of London came into view. The sight of the city where she had spent so many years as a member of the royal family brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was comfort in the familiarity, but also a sense of returning to a prison whose walls were made of duty, protocol, and endless public scrutiny. "The king is waiting for you at Clarence House," Matthews informed her as they approached the outskirts of the capital. "He wanted to meet you there rather than at the palace to ensure more privacy for your conversation." This was the first mention of Charles since they had left the airfield, and Camilla felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She had no idea what her husband's reaction would be to her attempted escape. Would he be angry at what he might see as a betrayal of their marriage and their royal duties? Would he be hurt that she had felt unable to confide in him about her plans? Or would he simply be relieved that a potential scandal had been avoided? The route to Clarence House had been carefully planned to avoid the main tourist areas where photographers might be stationed. The convoy of vehicles moved through London's back streets with practiced efficiency, but Matthews noted several instances where cars seemed to be following them for suspiciously long distances. The media's hunger for royal stories was legendary, and the unusual security arrangements around Camilla's movements would only fuel more speculation. As they pulled into the secure courtyard at Clarence House, Camilla caught sight of several additional security vehicles and personnel that hadn't been there during her morning departure. The visible increase in protection measures was both reassuring and troubling, suggesting that the authorities were taking the security implications of her actions very seriously indeed. Charles was waiting in his private study, a room that had always been their sanctuary from the pressures of public life, but today the familiar space felt different, charged with tension and unspoken recriminations. He stood as she entered, his face carefully controlled but his eyes betraying the depth of his concern and confusion. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the room that had witnessed so many intimate conversations during their marriage. "I think we need to talk," Charles said finally, his voice carrying the weight of years of diplomatic training, but also unmistakable personal pain. Alone. Matthews and the other security personnel withdrew to the adjoining room, close enough to respond to any emergency, but far enough away to allow the royal couple the privacy they needed for what promised to be a difficult conversation. Through the secure communication system, he could hear Victoria Sterling coordinating with Downing Street about the potential political implications of the incident, while other teams worked frantically to identify and plug the sources of the media leaks. Inside the study, Camilla and Charles faced each other across a gulf that seemed to have opened during the weeks of mounting pressure and mutual withdrawal. The charity scandal had driven a wedge between them that neither had been able to address directly, their conversations becoming increasingly formal and distant as the media circus intensified around them. "Why didn't you come to me?" Charles asked, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Why did you feel you had to run away instead of talking to your husband about what you were going through?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications about their marriage, their roles, and the impossible pressures of royal life. Camilla found herself struggling to articulate feelings that had been building for months, the sense of isolation and helplessness that had driven her to such desperate measures. "Because I didn't think you would understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because every time I tried to bring up my concerns, you retreated into being the king instead of being my husband. Because I felt like I was drowning, and everyone around me was more concerned about protecting the institution than protecting me." The words struck Charles like physical blows, forcing him to confront the ways in which his devotion to duty had perhaps blinded him to his wife's suffering. The man who had spent his entire life preparing to be king was discovering that the crown could be as much a barrier as a blessing. Even in his most intimate relationships, outside, Matthews received word that the first news report about the incident was about to break. Despite all their efforts to contain the story, someone had leaked enough information to piece together the basic facts of Camilla's attempted departure and subsequent return. The race against time to manage the crisis was about to enter its most critical phase. The news broke at exactly 4:17 p.m. London time, as the BBC's royal correspondent appeared on screen with the carefully worded report that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Sources close to the royal family confirm that the Queen Consort was involved in what palace officials are describing as a security incident earlier today. While details remain limited, it appears that concerns about her safety led to increased protection measures and the cancellation of several planned engagements. Inside Clarence House, the sound of the television in the adjacent room reached Charles and Camilla through the heavy oak doors of the study, marking the moment when their private crisis became a public spectacle. The months of speculation and innuendo about the charity scandal had now exploded into something far more dramatic and personal, with implications that neither of them could fully grasp in the immediate aftermath of the revelation. Victoria Sterling burst into the outer room where Matthews and his team were monitoring the situation, her face pale with the realization that all their efforts to contain the story had ultimately failed. The carefully constructed narrative they had hoped to present was already being overtaken by wild speculation and conspiracy. Theories spreading across social media at lightning Speed. We have maybe 30 minutes, before every major news organization in the world is camped outside these gates. She announced to the assembled crisis team. The palace press office is being bombarded with inquiries, and the Prime Minister's office is asking for a full briefing on the security implications. Inside the study, Charles and Camilla had barely begun to address the fundamental issues in their marriage when the reality of the public exposure crashed down upon them. The conversation they needed to have about trust, communication, and the impossible pressures of royal life would now have to wait while they dealt with the immediate crisis of managing public perception and institutional damage. "We need to make a statement," Charles said, his voice taking on the formal tone that Camilla had come to dread. "Something that addresses the security concerns without confirming the more damaging speculation." But Camilla was no longer willing to simply accept the palace's traditional approach of denial and deflection. The morning's attempt at escape had changed something fundamental in her relationship with the institution she had married into, and she found herself unwilling to simply return to the old patterns of behavior that had brought them to this crisis point. "No more statements written by committees," she said firmly. "No more carefully worded non-denials that satisfy no one and convince nothing. If we're going to address this publicly, then we tell the truth about what happened and why it happened." The suggestion horrified Charles, whose entire approach to royal life had been built around the principle of never explaining, never complaining, and never revealing the personal struggles that lay behind the public facade. The idea of openly discussing marital difficulties, personal stress, and institutional failings went against everything he had been taught about protecting the monarchy's mystique and authority. "You don't understand the implications," he protested. "Once we start explaining our private lives to the public, where does it end? The institution depends on maintaining a certain distance, a certain dignity that comes from not engaging with every piece of gossip and speculation." Outside, the first television crews were already arriving at the palace gates, their satellite trucks and cameras transforming the usually dignified surroundings into something resembling a media circus. Photographers with long lenses positioned themselves at every possible vantage point, hoping to capture even a glimpse of the protagonists in the unfolding drama. Matthews found himself coordinating not just security measures but also the complex logistics of media management as reporters from around the world descended on London. The story had all the elements that made for international headlines: royal scandal, marital drama, mysterious disappearances, and the kind of behind-the-scenes palace intrigue that fascinated audiences everywhere. The pressure for answers was mounting by the hour, with opposition, politicians already calling for parliamentary inquiries into the security arrangements surrounding the royal family. The incident had exposed vulnerabilities in the protection systems that had been considered virtually impregnable, raising questions about everything, from vetting procedures to communication protocols. But perhaps most damaging of all was the human element of the story that was beginning to emerge through carefully sourced reports and anonymous quotes. The picture being painted was of a woman under such extreme pressure that she had felt compelled to flee the country, and of a royal family so dysfunctional that they had failed to recognize or address her distress before it reached a crisis point. As evening approached, and the media frenzy showed no signs of abating, Charles and Camilla found themselves facing a choice that would define not just their personal relationship, but also the future direction of the monarchy itself. They could retreat into the traditional palace response of silence and deflection, hoping that the story would eventually fade from public attention, or they could take the unprecedented step of addressing the crisis with the kind of honesty and transparency that the modern public increasingly demanded from their institutions. The decision they made in those crucial hours would determine whether the incident became a footnote in royal history or a turning point that fundamentally changed the relationship between the monarchy and the people it served. As the world watched and waited for their response, both Charles and Camilla understood that there was no going back to the way things had been before that. Morning's attempted escape had exposed the fault lines running through the very heart of the royal family. The golden cage that had contained their lives for so long had been cracked open, and now they faced the daunting challenge of deciding what kind of life they wanted to build in the glare of unprecedented public scrutiny. The story that had begun with a desperate attempt at freedom had become something much larger and more complex, with implications that would resonate far beyond the immediate crisis and into the future of the British monarchy itself.